Thank you, Nathan, and also thanks to Pitar and Tomislav for inviting us today. Especially thanks to Pitar for finding me a 60mm projector with about a day's notice. That was great. Alexi, that talk was really phenomenal, so I'm actually going to sort of track it down a gear, I suppose. I'm not presenting a paper as such, I'm presenting a screening and an introduction to what can be called recycled cinema, in particular the trajectory of this from the early 20th century in terms of US and European artist film practice. So Evan and I have chosen to present together today, which is really the start of a longer-term research project that investigates recycled cinema practices as a starting point for an in-depth account of the circulation between industrial cinema and artist film from the beginning of the 20th century, one which takes into account the slippage of discourse between film studies and art history, and that's really underpinned by the changing economic conditions in both industrial cinema and artwork production. It's actually, we're going to be co-organising a colloquium at MPAC in a few weeks' time, which is bringing together a mixed group of film theorists, art historians, artist filmmakers to sort of flesh out these issues. So whilst Evan will focus much more on a theoretical account of industrial cinema, my screening program comes out of a series of observations from my work programming and producing artist film video both in gallery and cinema contexts over the last decade. Both, however, are framed around cinema and circulation, specifically in terms of the recycling of film material, and hopefully point towards an alternative reading of cinema itself. It's kind of important, I guess, to nudge at the boundaries between industrial and critical cinema, tracing a technique that potentially resists cultural periodization and that can track the implications of the economic forces underlying both the production of both forms. Critical film or artists' moving image practices, although of course having their own very specific and developed histories and art historical context, cannot be read without an understanding of industrial cinema's conditions of production, distribution, and finance. It's precisely these conditions that are made explicit in recycled cinema practices. I'll define that a little bit more after the first screening. And it's kind of really surprising how their importance in terms of their relationship to the structures of the production and consumption of industrial cinema and the very particular circulation of capital between the two has been tracked. The two forms of cinematic production not only recycle materials in terms of actual film prints, video and digital footage, but also in the cycling of ideas, experimentation, and often expertise from artist filmmakers now who make commercials and music videos as an adjunct to their practice to kind of fund their experimentation with film, to militant filmmakers who use the facilities of the commercial film studios that they work in during the day to make kind of radically political films at night. What separates the two in a basic way, of course, is finance, distribution, and reproducibility. Industrial cinema and critical film clearly operate in very different markets. So in the first part of the screening, I'd like to present a selection of artist films that make clear how capital is circulated via the prints themselves, from industrial cinema to artist film, and how in the appropriation of often degraded, misused, misplaced, and censored footage that betray actually the process of their own circulation, these artists reinscribe new narratives on these materials whilst they sort of somehow retain their historic specificity via the marks and scratches, dust, extraneous materials. So if these scratches, dust and fading on the found prints can essentially map a city in terms of first, second, third print runs, moving from the centre to the periphery, some of these prints then will actually start a new loop of circulation via artist film, one that's bound up in the Cineclub, the museum, and the gallery, and in more recent years, of course, the Internet Archive. And of course, in rare cases, some of these are then traded for huge sums in the unregulated market that is called the art world. Whilst industrial film is produced as a multiple, an endless stream of identical images played over and over in different locations at the same time, artist films are implicitly destined for a smaller audience, which is a shame, usually fetishized for being unique, a single print of an edition series, or, I mean, quite literally the art object. Whilst industrial cinema resources are plunged into strict illusionistic codes that deny the presence of material recording apparatus, artist films often expose these apparatus, and in doing so, the economy of artist film production itself, the production of time, of mistakes, of cuts, leader, outtakes, the camera, and all other material traces. Editing and montage was actually developed as a cinematic technique to produce the illusion of spatial viewpoints as if continuous in time, hiding this lengthy production process. And as a counterpoint, artist film often makes visible these material traces. Actually, to quote this a phenomenal Viennese experimental filmmaker, Martin Arnold, who I'd love to show today, but I don't think we have time. So this is a quote. "When you look at a strip of film, you will see at first the regular sequence of frames that represents a three-dimensional space. Those are the tracks the camera left behind. The apparatus inscribed itself onto the material. If you look more closely into the frame, you will see tracks of people and objects which were in front of the camera at the time of recording." So before I go any further into defining exactly what I mean by recycled cinema, I'll jump forward and show you a short video by Dara Birnbaum. It's called Technology Transformation Wonder Woman. And many of you might have already seen this. It's a very famous video. It was made in 1978, and it's often cited as one of the first examples of appropriation of televisual footage. Using pirated television tapes, Birnbaum spliced together every transformation scene from the 70s television show. And through isolating and repeating the moment of transformation, she exposes and deconstructs the relationship of gender representation to a televisual pop cultural iconography. I wanted to start with this one rather than one of the films that explicitly recycles celluloid, as it is absolutely located within a postmodern discourse, specifically in terms of its use of appropriation as a way to subvert dominant representations of gender, as well as destroying narrative conventions of cinematic technique. However, what is interesting to note is that Birnbaum came from a structuralist film background, again, which I'm going to be talking about more after. Her videos certainly betray this, which you'll see in a minute, and in doing so, they gesture towards a larger continuity of what you could call a recycled cinema practice, including a digital cinema or televisual cinema recycling. So instead of cinema prints, she obviously just uses television as source material. So just as a footnote before I present this, in yesterday's discussion of periodization, I actually completely changed the film program to really, as what I felt was missing when we were talking about postmodernism in particular, was really at the kind of tracking the shift, some massive shifts in technological development that really sort of push forward these differences of cultural production. And in particular spectatorship during that period, whether via television, home video, and subsequently, of course, the internet in the 1990s. And in response to this, I've chosen to present films and videos today that were made at the heart of and in response to these changes in spectatorship, and that have all been read as innately postmodern. So they're starting from 78, and I'm going into the mid-90s. So let's go. So yes. I'm just going to skip. Okay. So recycled cinema. To very simply define recycled cinema for the purpose of today's screening, at least, it's a tendency that can be traced over just short of a century of artist filmmaking, in which artists compile, edit, juxtapose, and modify found footage from industrial cinema, newsreels, educational films, pornography, documentaries, and travelogues in radically different ways to produce works that seek to reinscribe contemporary narratives onto celluloid and video, whilst also highlighting the scratches, dust, glitches, and extraneous materials that would allow this retention of their original historic specificity. Recycled cinema as a technique specifically used in artist films can be traced back to the 1930s, with Joseph Cornell cutting up East of Borneo, which was a 1931 industrial film, to make Rose Hobart, which is a film that cuts every frame that included the actress together in very quick succession, a sort of tightly edited montage of his obsession, essentially, with the actress. Of course, montage and compilation techniques have been used and experimented with from the beginning of cinema in all its forms, from newsreels and mainstream film practices, but Rose Hobart was and remains to be highly influential for subsequent generations of artists, and is thus a useful marker in terms of the trajectory of recycled cinema practices in experimental film. The title of our presentation today, what's the title? Invisible Architecture on Cinema and Circulation, was actually kind of paraphrased or sort of bastardized from a description of Cornell's work by Jonas Mekas in The Village Voice in the 1970s. So, quote, "What Cornell's movies are is the essence of a home movie. They deal with things very close to us, every day and everywhere. Small things, not big things. Not wars, not stormy emotions, dramatic clashes or situations. His images are much simpler. The home movies of Cornell are the invisible cathedrals of our age. That is, they're almost invisible unless you look for them." So, I mean, what especially you can take from this is that recycled films can or attempt to make visible the everyday. They provide an architecture by which to excavate and privilege the obsolete and the censored. By combining Hollywood with home movies, stock footage, newsreels, and projection apparatus, they can present historical inconsistencies and expose the circulation of capital by destroying the hierarchy of cinematic technique. They reanimate materials, forgotten histories in the archive, make visible distribution networks and technological change. So while structuralist and expanded cinema practices, notably those of London Filmmakers Co-op, to use an example with Malcolm LeGrice, Peter Goodell, McCall, etc., they took their resistance to dominant cinema, which is actually a way that Malcolm LeGrice prefers to describe this kind of industrial cinema as a dominant form, because it's really when in early cinema this idea of kind of a strict narrative was only one way that it could have gone. By identifying with both pre-cinema techniques and the visual arts, the performative, the one-off, the non-reproducible. However, critical film practices that tend towards techniques of recycled cinema, found footage or compilation film, take on past and present landscapes of dominant media production itself, namely industrial cinema and mainstream media in all its forms, which creates a new, albeit smaller circulatory loop for found footage via the art institution and underground cinema. They continue the flow of materials from the realm driven by the commercial into something more experimental and radical, and they degrade as they go. Recycled cinema squares up to its industrial big brother. It steals not only the projector light and exposes its apparatus, but also the actual film strip. Recycled cinema exposes the circulation of capital by kidnapping the actual material, splicing it up and betraying its intention. By isolating and sabotaging the images, these practices make a real comment on structures and specificity of dominant media forms. So from dumpster diving, archive looting, to eBay and DVD rips, both celluloid and digital practices of appropriation retain their material trace. Dara Birnbaum, who arguably created the first of what we now term as like a YouTube mashup, could not have, of course, foreseen the technological leaps that would have allowed in terms of moving image, of the kind of excavation of moving image material to be freely drawn. Instead, she actually stole the tapes from television centres. These kind of big clunky boxes of beta SP, which is hardly easy to hide in your pocket. So the next clip that I want to show, I think we don't have time to show the whole thing. I'm actually going to go back to another highly influential maker in the history of recycled cinema. I'm going to show Bruce Conner's A Movie. It's from 1958. It preceded an explosion in prefabricated filmmaking, particularly in California in the latter part of the 20th century. And it's kind of, again, like you might have already seen this film, so that's why I'm only going to show a small part of it. It's online if you want to see the whole thing. But it's also important to say in terms of Bruce Conner, like he was really like a painter and a collage, like a wall-based collage artist prior to this. And he wanted to make a film, and for him it wasn't just about kind of like interrogating the apparatus of cinema, it was also just a sort of economic force. He could use these reels, and it was therefore cheap to make a film, which I think is also something that's very crucial about these practices and the kind of very explicit differences between industrial cinema production and artist film. I'm going to be doing a second part of this screening, but I'm actually going to let Evan do a kind of full paper in between so that we can kind of bookend it. But just a few things about Mathias Muller's film. I mean, obviously he has a huge collection of Hitchcock films and is kind of very obsessed by kind of isolating the repetitive gestures that Hitchcock makes in the, he has the same choreography of his actors in pretty much every single film. But the interesting thing about this film in particular is also that rather than using the original stock or kind of finding it in an archive, he actually filmed it from television that you can see from the quality of the image. So in essence, trapping these sort of screen stars, not only in the film strip, but consigning them to the house in a more literal way, which reinforcing the anxiety of the sort of death of cinema as a space of sociability, it presents a, quote, cinema of excerpts, laying bare the difference in viewing conditions of distraction and isolation that the rise of home video was seen to embody, which Evan will talk a lot more about in his presentation. I just wanted to quote Akira Mizuta Lippert in his book Ex Cinema. Bound by the house, the corridors, rooms and passages that constitute it, the women retreat, their bursts of energy and collapse. The women's turns, retreats, bursts of energy and collapse that drive the film expose an economy of the household and its particular hold on the sexual and emotional dynamic of its women. Economy is made literal in Home Stories, the hysterical history of American cinema, no longer at home in its home. So this transition between celluloid and video brings me to the end of the first part of the screening. And after Evan's spoken, I'll actually finish with 3 films that use digital recycled cinema techniques for more explicitly political ends, also using very different framework of recycled cinema, one which really is sort of, you could term the essay film or kind of an experimental documentary format.
Well, indeed, as Nathan mentioned, this is my 3rd year in a row here, and it's a really lovely pleasure to be back. So thanks, Nathan, for the invite. Thanks, Tomislav and Petar, and everyone else at Mama who have met and didn't know before for having us here. It's always one of the better parts of my year, and a time to catch up and eating like octopus and things. So there's secondary pleasures. What I'm maybe perhaps fitting for having been here before, what I'm going to talk about in a way almost sort of picks up with a point that I ended with last year. In a certain sense, I sort of left it, it's what Machiavelli talks about, the dentations in buildings. That basically when you build even unfinished walls, you make sure to leave bricks out that other ones can be hinged into. So this is sort of an awkward tower building in a quite different direction, or perhaps, following our metaphor, something like a basement, sort of invisible architecture. And so also given my kind of recurrent genre obsessions, I thought I'd start with continuity around robbers and cops, which I think we should stop saying cops and robbers and don't let cops have the leading game in that. But okay, I'll break my computer. I'll start though with a kind of a cinematic scene that I unfortunately can't show you, but I'll just sort of narrate it to you. And this takes place in a Brooklyn theater in 1929 with a couple crooks or robbers. So after sneaking inside, they overpower a watchman and they tie him to a chair in the orchestra pit. And then a second watchman, who happens to be the father of the first, appears, and they subdue him as well. Demanding the combination to the safe, they tighten a cord around the neck of the younger watchman, nearly strangling him as his father is forced to watch. But at that very moment, a loud, ghostly voice echoes through the auditorium, and the spectral sound grows louder and louder, causes the horrified bandits to run for their lives. Elsewhere in the theater, electricians, oblivious to the crime and process, were working on the newly installed sound system. The voice emanated from a Vitaphone disc that accompanied an early talkie. So the reason I can't show you this is because it's a real scene that happened in a cinema. It's not a scene from a movie, it's an actual occurrence that happened in a Brooklyn theater in 1929, as Rhodes talks about in his amazing book, The Perils of Moviegoing, which details the sort of plague of the perils of moviegoing 1896 to 1950, in which you realize that actually many of the primary determinations of early cinema had nothing to do with the exploration of screen space, etc., but how to make sure that only the projectionists got burned when inevitably there were fires, how to avoid picturitis, which was a particular form of imagined eye strain that had to do with watching motion pictures. Actually, the first proposal for color film had nothing to do, again, with captivating audiences. It thought it would be easier on the eyes, as well as avoiding prostitution, pickpockets, typhus, variant other particularly cinematic afflictions. So this, for me, this sort of remarkable story, which hasn't been filmed but should, is a sort of exceptionally thick instance. It's not an allegory, but it's a concrete part of the history called cinema. And that's what I mean by, when I talk about cinema, I mean a history, a historical sequence. And it's one that, like I mentioned, reads like a movie setup. The cross-cut to the father approaching, unbeknownst, the match-on action as he enters the room, the father forced to watch his son be strangled, complete, of course, with empathy close-ups in the father's tortured face, and then that noise from off-screen. And just as this story seems to blur its space, its narrative, and its setting, it's also a story about the uncanny intersections of form and material. In a moment when a new technique of articulation, namely sound film, synchronized sound, has come on the scene but lacks a structure of experience and cognition to grapple with it. That's to say the robbers are foiled because there are not supposed to be bodiless voices in the cinema, right? Now, it actually was fitting with, as often is the case, there's a lot of overlap between what Lex, I think, is driving at and what I am, albeit from different source material, but a number of hinge points. This being one of them, because this is what I'd call a nihilist moment of history, where a gap is opened between a set of effects and the structures of meaning envisioned falsely to be wholly adequate to them. The world denaturalizes, if only for a year or two, before cannier robbers learn that the werewolf's howl coming from next door is a recording of Lon Chaney, not a vengeful spirit of the night. And so if this first story is one of generative disjunction, where history makes itself felt in a lag, the other side might be this, and I'll give you this in question. There we go. Sorry, I've got to shuffle many windows here. Might be this, something that'll be extremely familiar to many of you here, that Nathan wanted to kill me for showing. Oh, it's not, sorry, it doesn't appear to be on this. Let me do one thing. What a damn shame. There we go. View slideshow. All right. I hope that was worth the wait, because, it's a pretty good mustache. So those who were here last year might have a glancing recollection of him. This is Maurizio Merli, an actor made famous from the cycle of low-budget Italian cop films that I talked about last year. But what only concerned last year was his proliferation across that cinematic cycle, the exhaustion of him both as a character and as an actor, midway through a series of near-identical bottle-blonde Italians in cashmere and mustache. It's a different moment that I want to attend to here. This is his moment. There's the two faces, pleasure, and yeah, right. But this is the moment I want to attend to. So this image, properly speaking, is not in the cinema. The frames flit by, they're shuttered, and we see just a squiggling flash. As you can see, basically this is 3 simultaneous frames that I've isolated and rendered vertical. The frames flit by, shuttered, and we see just a squiggling flash. It's on the film, its source somewhat opaque. An emulsion failure for a film too cheap to care, a comet, a scratch, a brief moment of the film getting stuck in the projector, coming close to catching flame, and instead just wrenching and scratching. Or, lastly, and most saliently for this talk, is another possibility, namely that the process of circulation happens, as a single reel is screened again and again, moving from higher cost first-run theaters in the city center out to the cheaper city theaters on the periphery after a lag time, pulled into rest, sent back out to the third runs, the fourth runs, the slums and the pseudo-pastures where the poor expelled from the city live, into the cinemas and church basements, and out and out. And in this process, the reel comes to be marked with scratches, and nicks, and missing frames and splices. And so, regardless of whether or not the film ever turns its gaze on the city, whether or not it maps it, or gives it long, lingering tracking shots to make ontological realist cinema theorists hot and bothered, it comes to carry with it an actual map of the city, with all the traces of where it's been. So this is the sort of, in some sense, I guess even following what Lex talking about, the sort of dialectical image at stake for me here is the question of the scratch produced by the simple process of the repetition of screenings. That's the kind of the image at hand here. Now, to see such a scratch is distracting, of course, but it's a material distraction. It's a drawing apart, which is what distraction means, a tearing that does not fully divide but remains split without leaving. But all despite the recurrent polemics against distraction, however justified they may have been, this here provides the condition for a different kind of looking and reading and grappling with a problem that the cinema designates and deepens and extends, no matter if what appears on that screen is a teary reunion of soldiers in arms, the buildings of Le Corbusier, or a hardcore beach blanket bingo. So what I'm going to move towards now is basically a sort of a perspective towards the cinema that's radically indifferent as to what happens on the screen whatsoever. And then I will, in a rare moment for me, turn to a film that many people would probably call good, rather than sort of a spate of films, and talk about Joris Ivens. So, let's grab a drink of water here. And of course, it should go without saying that because we're doing a really long program, please go to the bathroom, get up and leave whenever you go. I'm not going to be all shocked and offended. Okay, so in terms of trying to be kind of adequate to the theme of this weekend, I thought I wanted to make a few comments to maybe follow up on historicizing and periodizing, etc. So I think the question we're all kind of grappling with here is just how much determination can or should or might be drawn between sequences, trends, one-offs, or swaths of cultural production, be it Dieter Roth or Fast and Furious 14, Bahrain Drift, which I hope will happen in the future. How much we can draw between these and historical transformations in the dominant set of social relations. Much more simply, historicizing, which for a decent chunk of thinkers means periodizing. It means squaring or drawing new lines between two identified phenomena, be it the swelling of the service sector or the troubling of the pictorial plane, with the usual breadth that insists not just on aligning single artists or movements, but trying to discern a previously underground or deep structure logic. That's basically what's at stake in historicizing claims more broadly. As for periodizing, which is the ground of, I think, this weekend, at its best, seems to me that it should mean producing the sense of a constitutive logic through a constant shifting back and forth, tracking the roots of mediation between the allegedly phenomenal, like a spate of werewolf films, and the allegedly determining, say the Keynesian turn toward the wage as an independent variable. Now, I'm calling the latter, that's to say the more explicitly transformations in the reproduction of capital, allegedly, not for any doubt about the real effects it has, but because I think there's a real blind spot that comes from the decision to treat one or another epochal logic not as descriptive, but as prescriptive. That's to say, to envision a situation where a general decline in manufacturing profitability must make its marks on every and all text, system, what have you. And you can see the disaster of this kind of thinking when a certain kind of Marxist, or whatever pseudo-Marxist get, I was going to say her or his, but it's pretty much just his hands on like superhero movies. And then Batman is, suddenly like a fascist or Occupy or the proletariat or not. And just this sort of totally inane thought that that's what it means thinking culture would be. So as Lex raised yesterday, I think the recurring question is one of ordering and cause. And as I gestured to, it's also fundamentally a problem of reading. It's about a method of materialist criticism that cracks open seemingly trans-historical holes and knots together the apparently arbitrary and irrelevant. That for me is the crux here. And I just want to this is the thing I think we'll save for the discussion, but to me one of the least attended to problems of periodizing is the fact that we very rarely periodize periodizing, right? Basically different shifts in how we understand the attempt to discern a kind of undergirding logic. Because even as the content shifts, or the key term of the secret decoder, etc., what's all too rarely asked is, why wouldn't also the relation of materials to their historical sequence itself be a historically shifting relationship? In fact, arguably the most historically shifting. Okay, so, however, this history of historicizing or a periodization of periodizing is probably, thank God, not my main task, so we can come back to this, but no more linguistic doubling. What I want to talk about is, of course, the cinema, and industrial cinema. And as I hinted, I mean a very specific thing by cinema. Quite simply, I mean the specific economic, spatial, social, and cultural form of going to a specific site and paying to stay in that space for a duration of time with others to watch mass-reproduced images. That, for me, is the crux of this. In the global north, because as we know, this story doesn't hold for countries like India, China, parts of Africa at the moment where cinema spectatorship continues to swell, the period of its coherence of the cinematic sequence or cinematic century is, broadly speaking, the first decade of the 20th century, especially cohering around just after the First World War, to the early 80s, with all the unevenness, yes, but actually a pretty coherent drift, especially in terms of three kind of terminal or decomposing factors. A, the decline in ticket sales across the global north. B, the decline in the construction of new cinemas. And C, the meteoric rise in ticket prices in the 1970s, especially accelerating around 1972 to 1980. They tried to compensate, obviously, for fewer people attending, and made a disastrous gambit that basically shoved most working class audiences out of the cinema in any serious way. So the reasons for the alleged decline or death of cinema are very well known and not always that interesting, from overextension of city sprawl to television to an economic crisis that put a squeeze on real wages, especially on the free time of housewives, i.e. capital's category of those who are de facto never not working. But what is interesting for me about all the doubts that I have about periodization aside is that this sort of cinematic century, it's hard to not see it lining up with a few sequences, in fact, particularly contributing to them. So perhaps most temptingly, one would go something like this. You have it go from the rise of the historical avant-gardes, and by this I mean both artistic and political, insofar as the immediate post-war years saw the tremendous wave of advanced social war, be it Bolshevik, Turanese, and German, as well, of course, as periods of futurism, surrealism, etc. To then, towards the 80s, the definitive collapse of global North revolutionary movements. Include here things like the destruction of the Black Panthers, the end of the Italian long 70s, and with that, the apparent demise of the creative and often nihil-hued burst of New Hollywood, New Spanish cinema, Italian critical cinema, New German, Japanese Fukiron, Czech New Wave, on, from Brazil to Canada, etc. And then all of this followed by what, for the most part, gets called both a period of counter-revolution, or neoliberalism if you prefer, of blockbusters and seriality, and of new media technologies, surveillance forms, and production logistics that the best thinkers of postmodernism are attentive to, and that indeed severely and seemingly irrevocably transform the texture of a social order. So none of these will quite suffice. I can give you a whole number of other kind of sequences for the simple answer that there's no kind of clear answer. It's multiply and locally determined. But what I want to ask after, and what's the real stake of this, is to say that while I'm not interested in speaking of the death of cinema, because that's sort of melodramatic and nostalgic, well, I won't say melodramatic, I love melodrama, it's nostalgic, I do want to assert that there was a concrete historical sequence in which a recurrent problem of capital, and that problem is the relation of circulation as it triangulates decomposition, accumulation, and distance, both temporal and spatial, that this concrete historical sequence answered this recurrent problem in a particular way. The name of that particular way is the cinema, or more precisely to designate, in my case, industrial cinema. Now, what's really interesting, I think, about this sequence is that it's not exactly necessary, at least not as a punctual emergence. I'm going to quote at length from Thomas Alcioser, I think arguably one of the sharpest thinkers on film. So he's kind of talking about looking back towards the beginning of the cinema. He says, take the so-called delay of cinema. If we were to time travel and place ourselves at the end of the 19th century, we could see the cinematograph in 1895 as both sleepy latecomer and a perilously premature birth. A latecomer because the technology of moving images had been known for almost 50 years, and also that the Lumiere's invention was in some respects no more than a mechanized slideshow, whose special effects for a brief time were inferior to any twin or triple turret magic lantern worked by a single lecturer assisting the skilled lanternist operator, which could supply sound and image, verbal commentary and color, abstractly moving designs and representations from life. So this is in some sense the weird delay of the cinema. But, Alcioser goes on, the cinema was also premature, or some would say an irrelevant detour altogether, because the late 19th century might have been posed on the brink of a quite different imaging technology, which the popularity of the cinema in some ways delayed. There's even a sense in which the cinema was not only a bastard, but an unwanted child altogether. According to television scholars, both Edison's Peep Show and Lumiere's public projection was not what the 19th century has been waiting for. What it was imagining for its technotopic future was domestic television, and preferably two-way television. The Victorians not only dreamt of TV, they were as hungry for mobility, instantaneity, for simultaneity and interactivity as we are today. And they also had a good idea of what it would mean to be connected to an internet. After all, they had developed a telegraph. End quote. So I'm really interested in this idea that cinema in some sense is almost a sort of a hostile accident that derails the fantasy of Twitter and sets it back by a good 100 years. Moreover, though, the cinematic century is not necessary in a philosophical sense. That's to say, it's never been self-perpetuating and autonomous. It's always borrowed from the other media that it equally rails against, bemoaning incursions by TV, video, and on from there. So take 3D, which many people see as a desperate attempt to lure audiences back into the real spectacle of being in space with others. You have Oscar Mescar's Alabaster 3D projections in 1901, and given early stereoscopic slides, it actually makes, I think, as much, if not more sense, to think of 3D as the original, not as a counter technique. And indeed, we're in a moment now, as so often before, where a set of seemingly extraordinary measures are called to reaffirm this particularity of cinema. See here, everything from IMAX and 3D to cinema bars. Actually, one of the first transformations of cinema as a discrete economy in the teens, the like 19-teens, was to basically not allow people to bring booze in, because one of the ways to assure middle-class audiences that proles wouldn't get too rowdy was to keep drinking outside and then basically make it a space of non-consumption. America will ruin this because you need popcorn for a number of reasons I'll explain, but the point is we're seeing a moment where actually the uncanny resemblance of early cinema is producing a strange sort of return to origins. So the question at the heart of what Vic and I are asking, I think, is what's the particular link between the cinema as a total process and the modern, the term here involving both the social complex of capital and the tangled lineages and self-proclamations of modernism? And more specifically, how does the concrete fact of cinematic decomposition and waste, both the historical transition away from a model of mass moviegoing and the smaller historical cycles of single reels, from studio to cinemas to dumpsters to artist films, those techniques brought back into advertising especially. How does that articulate that link? That's the real question. And in order to answer this, I want to raise, and also to contribute, I think, to the discussions yesterday, I want to raise two other takes on the modern I find particularly salient. I'm very interested in the idea that a kind of non-periodized notion of the modern or counter-periodized. So these are two weird ones, but I think they're rather relevant. This is important. I'll come back to that. This is a William Bunge, radical cartographer out of Detroit. I'll return to this, but this for now. So the two things I want to touch on are Sergei Eisenstein's interpretation of Piranesi's Carcere d'Invenzione from 1750, and Martin Trachtenberg's proposal to think of Gothic architecture as a medieval modernism. Okay, so my reason for these seemingly very non-cinematic things, other than Eisenstein, obviously, is that both of them give a sense to what I've tried to explain previously as the gap between negation and destruction. The former, namely negation, designating the removal of the bonds of social and historical coherence that reproduce forms and phenomena, as opposed to necessarily the destruction, dissolution, or maybe we can talk about dissipation as a different form as well. So for both Eisenstein and Trachtenberg, their glance backwards opens up a process of the modern that's far from the more familiar accounts of either a drive towards abstraction, a Badiousian passion of the real in its subtractive mode, or an interrogation of the conditions of a medium, a kind of high modernist rhetoric of that. So I'll let Eisenstein go first. Discussing the prison drawings, namely these ones, he writes, quote, "The concrete reality of perspective, the real representational quality of the objects, is never destroyed anywhere. The madness consists only in the piling up, in the juxtapositions that explode the very foundation of the object's customary possibility, a madness that groups objects into a system of arches that go out of themselves, in sequence, ejecting new arches from their bowels," which I think is a really lovely image, shitting staircases and arches. A system of staircases exploding in a flight of new passages of staircases. A system of vaults that continue their leaps from each other into eternity. Now it is clear what the next stage will or should be. And at this point, this is when Eisenstein is basically describing what we often think of as the sort of pictorial and spatial conditions of modernism, particularly in a kind of Picasso and Cubist moment. What is left to explode is the concreteness. A stone is no longer a stone, but a system of intersecting angles and planes, in whose play the geometrical basis of its forms explodes. End quote. So what's Eisenstein talking about here? In short, it's a sort of excrescent ruination. In what ruins the objects, and by objects here he means also that which has historical unity, what ruins them are born of them. Their forms as distinct from objects are not the support of the objects, they're not its template or its ideal, but the process that disintegrates them, right? And they only become discernible as forms because of this replicating and crowding process in which staircases are born of staircases, columns are born of columns, etc., in which each thing becomes multiple and grouped and sequenced, going out of themselves. And so it enters history not as tradition, but as rip-off. That's to say, entering capital's cycle of reproduction and fashion. So forms can only be discerned where phenomena could before. Put it on a painting and you basically have variant forms of kind of cubo-futurism. As for Trachtenberg, he identifies something equally key, though distinct. His is not a logic of the excrescent multiplier, but rather a breaking distraction and a self-cannibalizing. I'm not going to go into the very long historical roots of his project, which are kind of mad, but great. I'm just going to isolate the mechanism here. So, in describing the shift from Romanesque to Gothic cathedrals, and the specific formal shift from, for those who care, groin vaults to rib vaults, he writes, quote, "Whereas the groin vault was conceived as two interpenetrating barrel vaults," we all kind of know what these look like there, I think, "producing groin lines of difficult to manage parabolic curvatures and folds, the rib vault instead began conceptually and in construction as an integral framework of discrete arches, each with an independently generated curvature, defined not by a mere edge, but by strong plastic form. And so the formerly secondary groin line thus becomes the visually primary rib, with the vaulting surface now appearing as the visually secondary infill, the web which serves as the ground for the dominant figure of the ribs. So in short, this process he's talking about, this historical transformation from Romanesque to Gothic, is one of misprision and borrowing. Especially what it is taking the secondary element and shoving it to the fore. There's a sort of interesting foreground, background, or sort of structural support and articulated figure moment here, but crucially without ever purging the terrain, right? It's a question of what to do with what you simply can't scrap fully. The problem of a negation of unity without attendant destruction also for him appears in the related rise of the pointed arch. I'll just give the short version of this. He's talking about this idea of the pointed arch is in some sense the paradigmatic thing that modernists, 20th century modernists got really excited about with Gothic architecture. And he says, although it's been variously interpreted in terms of bent tree branches, heavenward thrust, Islamic precedent, and so forth, I propose that to the contemporary spectator, contemporary at the time of the churches, it would have looked most of all not pointed, which is a post-medieval English term, but like a broken arch, i.e. as in the relatively recent French arc-pisé. That's to say, regardless of its key role in resolving geometric and structural problems of the rib vault, the form would have been seen, especially in the early period of its use, as a literal breaking and reconstitution of the semicircular unbroken arch that through the entire Middle Ages was one of the primary historicist elements, a central point of reference to antiquity, whose architectural authority was now being shattered and replaced by a new modernist system. One might say that the broken arch was an indexical sign of the revolution, end quote. Rather overreaching, but nevertheless. The key point here is that the shattering and replacing is of the architectural authority of antiquity. It's not the process led by the form itself, or a stylistic shift first, which is, crucially for him, a breaking and preserving. The broken arch is left in place as broken, right? Or the supplantation, basically in the switch of the groin vault to rib vault, involves a use of the secondary becoming primary, the primary becoming a simply infilled web. So the key mechanism here, what I'm trying to articulate, is that in both of these forms, in Eisensteinian reading of Piranesi, and in Trachtenberg's reading of, for example, this is the Cathedral at Reims, you have in both cases an understanding of the development of new forms and of processes of historical negation that do not require a notion of a kind of purgative fantasy of starting from anew, right? It's a kind of very thick account of what it means to negate and be stuck with the scraps of that process. Okay, now let's make a major leap here. I'm struck by these two minor conceptions because I think they make sense of the cinema. And I don't mean cinematic style. I mean something very different. Because the basic crux of the cinema is the negation of the original through the reproduction, decomposition, and non-destruction of the multiple, what reenacts itself across spaces, what serially modifies previously established generic tropes, and what will get replayed until its circulation ceases the purpose of circulation, which is to say, to transform money into commodities and back into money and on from there. Oh, what time is it, by the way? I don't want to be brutal. Or how long have I been speaking? How long have I been speaking for?
You've been speaking about 35 minutes.
Okay.
Oh, 30.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. It's not going to be that long a ride, don't worry. So, for me, we'll bring back up the bunch, this relevant, remarkable image. So I just want to, in a very basic way, what actually are the conditions of cinema? This is perhaps more analogical than exactly what I'm describing, but he's a radical cartographer trying to understand the leaching of money out from the slums of Detroit. But it's basically what I'm talking about. What are the conditions of cinema? Basically, what did the cinema mean? How does it function? And this is obviously I'm talking about during the period of celluloid, during the coherence of the need to kind of have physical reals move between physical spaces. So one, prints are not owned. You don't own the print. And by you, I mean both spectators and the exhibitors, crucially. If you're a projectionist or you own a Lowe's theater, you don't own or buy the prints. You rent them. And so too, ticket costs are not owned or held by those who exhibit them. During the first 2 weeks to 2 weeks of a film's release, as new releases, this is actually still the case, the exhibitors of the cinemas themselves get usually 0% of the ticket sales, and at most like 5 to 10% of that take, meaning that you have weeks where your only income is popcorn, right? So the key thing is basically you don't own the print, and even seemingly the money that you would gain from the ticket sales in order to people to access that print are themselves taken by the distributors. So that's one. Two, the apparatus, aka the projector, is not owned by spectators. That's important because that differentiates it from the radio, the television, the streaming video insofar as you use a laptop, the book, the phonograph, etc., right? Three, spaces of viewing are not owned by spectators. Basically, you don't watch them in the home. The cinema is not watching in the home. Four, until very late, there wasn't much choice about what to see. One went to the movies. You didn't pick a film, you went to the movies. On a related note, until very late, there were not particular start times. And as we know, films looped. One kind of entered the stream of them, they looped again. At some point, you stuck around until midway through the next cycle. Next, 8, I believe I am, or 7, or 6. For working class audiences, and this is in Europe and America both, and this is true up through the 70s, knowledge of what films were coming was overwhelmingly based on posters in the city or at the cinema itself. That's to say, the cinema was not known, what was coming at the cinema was not known through newspaper or text reviews based on picking or selecting a film before. It basically, the advertising itself was part of the texture of the city. And this is like demographically true, I'm not just speculating. There's actually statistics that look at this. And lastly, or second to lastly I suppose, one does not watch obviously an original object in two senses. We know quite obviously it's not a singular or erratic thing, including a performance. And more interestingly for me, you very rarely are watching it for the first time. You're not watching an unused print, a pristine one, or one that was designed specifically for that site. 9, films remained in circulation for an extremely long time. The run system, and that's to say the first run, second run, third run, worked by means of release at a prestigious theater, the withdrawal of the print for a period, normally about 2 weeks, re-release to second run theaters, withdrawal, re-release, and so on. New York City had 7 runs, basically, so this process extends out there. And films have remained during the kind of cinematic century in play anywhere from a few months at minimum to about 2.5 years, if not longer, right? And I think this is important because it shatters the idea we have of a kind of film being about a singular moment. When you understand that reels are for 2, 3 longer years, etc., especially as it reaches out into the countryside and the prole populations that radical directors want to think their films are capturing the logic of, you have to grapple with the fact that if they're seeing them at all, they're seeing them like 3 years later, right? So the latter was the standard, as I mentioned, in Europe, especially up until the 70s. This ends, we know, with the market flooding of the blockbuster, aka the mass simultaneous release, which set the logic the rest of the industry had to follow and match, as well as the lure of shorter theater runs to release more quickly on VHS, DVD, etc. Okay, lastly, the last sort of condition of cinema I think that's relevant here is that throughout its entire history, or as soon as there was something in most national industries like the majors with attempted vertical integration, or at least just the capital to pull off block booking. Block booking is when, in order to give, if someone wants to rent a print of something like Star Wars, the company's like, yeah, but you also have to take Porky's 3 or whatever. So if you want the good, you have to take whatever shit they feed you with it also. Only companies with enough clout and blockbusters can pull off this move. So throughout the history of the cinema, other films, other production studios, other lines of thought and making took this on as their condition. They kind of accepted the logic of the spatial cycling of films out and out from the center, and unable to compete with block booking, they started making films explicitly for the periphery, or in often the US reverse logic, that would be the inner city or the ghetto, depends if we're talking about what model of the city, but which are intended not to last as long, basically. They degrade more quickly. I don't mean in terms of the physical celluloid, but in terms of their consumer durability. Insofar as lower investment per film meant that adequate returns necessitated releasing another, often nearly identical film as quickly as possible. So you have, in a certain sense, a huge swath of cinematic production that accepts this condition and basically makes a wager on excising the center of the city, on giving up on first and second run. Third run, drive-in, grindhouse, etc. is predicated on an acceptance of like proles watch prole films, that the films themselves are kind of like made cheaply and as fast as possible. So taking this complex as a whole, I'm reminded of Roussel's analysis of the oddness of the date picked as the origin of the movies. And Roussel makes the point about why we ask if it was first shown to a scientific community or before paying public. As we know, it was decided, and he's talking with the 1895 Lumiere date, that only the paying audience really counted, with the result that in the end, it took 4 or 5 different, some would say arbitrarily selected, qualifiers and limiting conditions in order to make the 28th of December 1895, the date, and the Lumiere brothers the authors of the invention of cinema. But despite his skeptical tone, he's actually not wrong, at least insofar as what I mean by industrial cinema, because it's the condition of coming to see for what is not work, and for entering the circuit of the transformation of capital. So let me just sort of put this spelled out plainly, why I think rent is basically the crux of cinema. This is something that's not been properly articulated yet. So the history of industrial cinema is not one of reflection, or of entertainment, or of diversion, but of circulation. It concerns an ongoing and uneven flow of rent, repetition, labor, and distribution. Looking back at the short cinematic century when this circuit was economically coherent and part of everyday life, and able to constitute huge swaths of film production, it becomes clear that the economic structure of the cinema was not, as some have liked to think, the consumption of a mass commodity, albeit, as a problem for them, a commodity that doesn't destroy what it consumes in direct proportion to its decay, unlike every other Category 1 commodity. Category 1 are value-producing commodities, fixed capital. No, the fundamental structure and experience of cinema is that of rent, and despite apparent affinities, cinema's kissing cousins are not TV or theater or radio, but the hotel. And so too, its closest form is not music or painting or the like, but architecture, because there's no other economic cultural form that involves such an enormous outlay of capital and such a large number of individuals intervening in the process, and such a large gap between supposed architect/auteur and the final product, and such a long process of decay and collapse that sets in. So with industrial cinema, spectators pay to rent a seat in a space that's not home, it's not workplace, and they pay not for a specific film, but they pay for a duration of time. A duration that only in more recent decades came to be strictly bound to the start and end time of a film. In a way, you could understand the history of cinema as a slow capture by the model of texts, basically, rather than an ongoing flow in which one partakes. The experience of cinema, therefore, was necessarily bound to that space, as a site of pause within the city's own flow. And unlike television, radio, home video, etc., the cinema was predicated on being unique to a specific site. A publicness in the dark, a conspiracy, quite literally, for an experience that swerves always between solitary and deeply collective. Yet in that space, whose rent, concession, and ticket purchases go towards covering, the audience watches the animation of a film not unique to that space, but rented, as I mentioned, a loss leader. Moreover, the singular experience one may have at that cinema is in front of what's been shown many times before, and what's been hustled around the city, taken in and out of storage, and worn thin. So, as I was arguing before, as those films are projected repeatedly, physically degraded, they come to express this repetition, regardless of whether or not the film involves a subtle meditation on capitalism, and often not. Okay, I'm gonna leap ahead a little bit here. In a way, this question is what we mean by invisible architecture, and giving it this title. That whole complex of terrain, time, rent, and duration made barely visible by those scratches. But on the other hand, to say that the cinema answers a problem of circulation means something very different, one less of the city than tackled similarly by cities. And what I mean by this, the problem of circulation, is the attempt to mediate between, on the one hand, the necessity of capital to ceaselessly transform, and on the second, the fact that the forms it takes from money to buildings to films are not necessarily destroyed in the process of their consumption, but in fact form a mass of the devalorized. Either the pristine that cannot find adequate return or buyer, or what's been so worn that it can no longer participate in the transformation process. So I'm very quickly just flesh out, I think, a more technical sense of what circulation means, because this really matters. And then I'll leap towards an ending so we can watch more movies. So as for what circulation means, Marx conveniently wrote a book on this topic, Book 2 of Capital, probably the least read of them. Ernst Mandel, our hated figure of the weekend, but right on this point called it the forgotten book, in spite or perhaps because of the fact that it had real influence on both Marxist and orthodox economics in these sort of technical discussions of schemes of reproduction. But a good point of entrance into what's at stake in Book 2 and why it's not just an arcane discussion was the original ending of Book 1, right near the original ending that was dropped by Engels, who was sort of really anti-circulation as a primary thought of this. So this was going to be right at the very end of Book 1. Quote, "The immediate result of capitalist production is the commodity pregnant with surplus value." It's a really kind of striking figuration. Pregnant with surplus value. "We are thus thrown back on our point of departure, the commodity, and with it to the sphere of circulation. What we have to deal with in the following book, aka Book 2, however, is no longer simple commodity circulation, but the circulation process of capital." And so the key point about Book 2 and the importance of the circulation of capital is that if, as Marx argues, quote, "it's impossible to make the transition directly from labor to capital," end quote, then the friction and messiness and opacity of these translations that alone produce and accumulate value are the topic of Book 2, this problem of kind of delay in time. And as Chris Arthur and Gert Reuthen put it pretty succinctly, quote, "Book 2 is not about circulation of commodities as distinct from their production. Rather, it's about the social circulation of capital, and as such, this circulation includes the time spent in the production process." So there's just two threads I want to isolate. I want to kind of pull out from here. One very quickly is what is meant by the social circulation of capital, sort of odd term. Now this doesn't concern the flow of commodities. That's what Marx calls commodity circulation. Book 1 is full of it. But their transformation through the commodity or money circuit, as I meant from money to money with the attendant primes, and as I argued, the friction and the loss and the addition, the faux frais, the overhead costs, and the decay that obtains with this. And so the basic issue, what's at stake and why we want to talk about social circulation of capital rather than just individual commodities, is it's about how the system of capital is predicated on and hoists itself on its own petard of trying to avoid one of two situations, in fact both of them, a sort of Scylla and Charybdis. So on one side, you have a split outcome of loss, and you have a loss either through decomposition or rot, i.e. stuff that you were trying to sell does not make it to market on time, and therefore is spoiled, or not sexy anymore, or whatever, no one wants it. You make an action, you make like a Fast and Furious rip-off film, and then you wait like 8 years, and people are into unicorn films, and so it's wasted, right? The other one, of course, would be a situation, the other side of that is the problem of overaccumulation, where you have standing side by side perfectly good labor and perfectly good capital, and they cannot integrate or interpenetrate, because basically capital can't find an adequate return on its investment. So you have basically a static situation where you could make do, but it will not happen. That's one problem that circulation is trying to dodge. The other one is a too narrow circuit that can't properly achieve this transformation through zones of low enough wages and cheap enough resources to make it MCM prime, not just MCM, so money, commodity, money prime, to not make it accumulate. So those are the two problems. On the one hand, too close an identity, where capital doesn't circulate widely enough, it doesn't transform, it doesn't pass through enough areas, you'd say, of uneven development, in order to pull this off. On the other hand, the prospect of goods either going wasted by rotting or wasted by being unused. Those are, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's like the kind of crux things. What's important about this and why I'm talking about cinema is this. Another thing that Engels dropped in later editions, which again is supposed to start, book 2 is supposed to start with the phrase explicitly echoing volume 1. It was going to start like this, quote, "The immediate result of the process of capitalist production is a mass of commodities." This is a key distinction he raises here, that what it produces is a mass of commodities. I think what's so interesting about that is that it implies that there's not a homology between how single commodities move and transform and pass through these circuits and how masses of commodities do. That basically once things become the prospect of what Marx often talks about as a hoard, not like a golden hoard or whatever, that sort of thing, but rather a hoard of gold, for example. Once things become in multiple, once they become a mass, there's a different velocity and problem to them. And what I'm basically kind of gesturing towards, and I think I'll probably wrap up so we can watch more films, because we have, how long have we been? I don't want to make people sit forever. I can go like forever, but that's not.
Yeah, that would probably really great for the best, but if you want to wrap up in 5 minutes or so, that would be great.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because this is, as we mentioned, this is part of a kind of much longer project about this. So, yeah, I'll just finish this sort of question here a little bit, and maybe link it back to our title. And if we want to much later, I was going to show a really remarkable Joris Ivens film from 1933 called The New Earth, which I think is one of the rare examples to tackle by means of the use of recycled images. I mean, we'll get to the end. It's really remarkable, but it's a sort of a heart-wrenching sort of Eisler type film. But we'll hold that off, I promise. So what I just want to raise is this question a little bit of, again, why invisible architecture? Well, one of the other things in this sort of echoes between calling cinema architecture, calling music cinema, et cetera, is the rather famous reference from Goethe when he talks about architecture as frozen music. The proper passage is, quote, he's kind of narrating himself. He says, "I have found a paper of mine among some others," said Goethe today, "in which I call architecture petrified music. Really, there's something in this. The tone of mind produced by he writes like such an asshole, it's unbelievable. The tone of mind produced by architecture approaches the effect of music." Now, Goethe doesn't make this up. He gets it from Schelling, who in Philosophie der Kunst says, architecture is music in space, as it were a frozen music. I don't speak German, so my apologies in the terminology, but the term used for this is erstarrte Musica. I think that's the basic term. Now, in the 20th century, Raymond Durnyat, a really remarkable and underappreciated British film writer and thinker, returns this theme and actually says, well, cinema is unfrozen architecture. So this is the question then, basically. Does that make cinema music? What's at stake here is the question of, do transformation processes also, even if they kind of freeze and unfreeze, is a process of crystallizing, petrifying, for example, capital becoming money, unfreezing, becoming commodity, unfreezing through labor, etc. Are there resistances? Are there scratches, etc.? Well, what of the figure of freezing in Marx, of petrifying, etc., becoming a mass of things? In volume 2 explicitly, this is a rather long passage, but it's important, he raises this. And he says, quote, "When viewed in their qualitative aspect alone, 110 pounds, the British pound, not weight, are the same as 100 pounds, namely money. And considered quantitatively, 110 is like 100, a sum of definite and limited value. If now the 110 be spent as money, that's to say rather than reinvested as productive capital, but spent just as money, they cease to play their part. They, the masses of money, are no longer capital. And then this is the sentence I'm interested in. Withdrawn from circulation, they become petrified into a hoard. And though they remained in that state till doomsday, not a single farthing would accrue to them. Money ends the movement only to begin it again. So, the word that Marx uses here is not this one that's raised previously by, as I mentioned, Staate, or however one pronounces it, basically, that's in Schelling Goethe, but it's the idea of versteinen, basically, to petrify, fossilize, and harden. Which is interesting because this, in this version, has this sense of some of the preservation of the original, right? Basically, there's the sense that although this thing hardens, the form remains. Elsewhere, of course, he talks about crystallization, but crucially, there's a different notion when he talks about the idea of like masses of labor, differently from the idea of something in circulation that becomes a hoard. The process he talks about when labor is poured into products is Gelehrte, which is to say, as Keston Sutherland has a remarkable essay about this, it's understood as basically the equivalent of a jellied meat product that you can't unboil. Basically, there's the idea that these things are congealed. It's a congelation of time that, unlike the idea of a freezing that can come in, come out, etc., rather there's something of the sense that it has undergone a process in which, if undone, it will not be a frictionless transition, right? It will remain kind of ever marked. And what's interesting to me about this is this seems to be the vision that so many theorists have of a cinematic audience, of what they mean by mass audience. Christian Metz, for example, who claims that the audience identifies not with characters, but with the projector itself, casting at the back of the skull, which one becomes a second screen, something like a jellied prism between the shadows cast by the fire of Plato's cave and the screen of its wall. He basically has a cinematic vision of spectatorship like the Blob in Larry Hagman's Beware the Blob, where it kind of wheels in front and all is cast by this jelly of ex-humans and kittens and hippies and all that sort of thing. But what interests me, I guess, is just this, and I can end on it, that there's a sort of rather perverse twist, which is that the cinema, that particular theater of time, comes to be the discursive zone where the historical dynamic and this interesting circuit of abstract labor and how abstract labor basically kind of is congealed in this way, that it's in the cinema where that is glimpsed correctly, basically, or at least through this messy mirror, while the peculiar dynamics of the cinema itself as a spatial and experiential technique of capital find their figuration in seemingly the very wrong place, not in terms of commodity experience, not in terms of laboring experience, but rather something like the experience of money itself. Except that when we are audiences, unlike money, this is a heterogeneous set. It's pulled from the flows of day and city, but we're not boiled or made anew by those experiences. Rather, one processes them. And this, I think, has to do, as Lex has raised, the problem of trying to become inhuman, which is, I think, a key problem, how one takes one's cues, not from the human mass, but from a mass of refuse, for example. And why would this matter? Well, very briefly, as Marx says, the Grundrisse, despite all the individual exchanges, etc., involving conscious will and hustling and the like, when he's talking about circulation, nevertheless, the totality of the process appears as an objective relationship arising spontaneously. It's a relationship which results from the interaction of conscious individuals, which is neither part of their consciousness nor a whole subsumed under them. And that's to say, in circulation, we see ourselves as other to ourself. We see ourselves as quantity, as duration, as one that is indeed dependent upon the production of the person as a quality that can kind of make choices, is one amongst these. And I just want to end by suggesting that these materials that Victoria and I are interested in working on, and that this is a kind of longer project, an understanding of the scrapped, the dumpstered, the tossed out, etc. materials, might be a different cue towards the idea of what it means to become a different kind of mass. That's to say a horde with a H-O-R-D-E. That one might understand the task of that as to enter as a sort of sticking point of circulation, to become a horde in the other sense. And the heart of this, I think, and what the films were trying to pull out and draw from, understand, the crux, is that this is not a boiling down into a sort of let's say, Debord's understanding of recycled images in cinema. The fundamental problem of Debord's understanding of cinema is an alleged indifference to them. He basically says, like, oh, they're basically interchangeable. One bikini ad is another. I think what the history of thinking about the kind of hostile horde of a mass become a horde, that's to say a mass become a sticking point, unusable, no longer transforming, but retaining its weird kernels, much as something like Eisenstein and Trachtenberg see that even the most exploded forms or most mutated ones carry within them this process of subsuming and kind of swallowing their own past, that one might learn to take a set of cues from something like masses of wasted cinema rather than from the fantasy of a unified vital force. So that's a rather sketchy ending, but we're going to have more time to talk and show more films. So I will hold off there and then we'll go on from there.
So the next film we want to show is called Handsworth Songs. It's from 1986 by Black Audio Film Collective, who are a UK-based film collective. It was actually made, it seemed kind of pertinent in terms of yesterday's discussion. It was made in response to civil disobedience in Birmingham and London, and the inability of the British media to get beyond its concern for demonising the rioters and their motives. And so using the actual television footage from the riots, it sort of presents both the footage of the riots and many interviews with a very, very wide range of people that were involved in it, and really is trying to rethink the idea of kind of what is a homogenous black community that was the British media sort of assumed this was about. So I was actually going to show 2 or maybe 3 more films, but maybe this is getting too late.
Let's just show Jim's movie.
I think 1 or 2 more films. Well, I mean, it depends how long they are.
They're not long.
Well, I was going to show, I could show part of the William E. Jones. William E. Jones is sort of particularly interesting in terms of his filmmaking practice, both in like a recycled way. He recycles celluloid, but more recently has spent a lot of time working with digital media. There's a film that he made in 1991.
Yeah, let's call it up.
Maybe if you can show 2 films within half an hour or something.
Oh yeah, we can definitely do that.
That's Jim's.
Yeah, I know, they're both in here. Is this a full screen? I believe so.
And this is called the Fall of Communism through Gay Pornography.
Right.
And that's as big as it goes, actually.
Yeah.
So I'll just show you a little clip of this. In the same way, actually, James Richards found, where was it? Which library was it?
In Tokyo.
In Turkey, he was Tokyo. Sorry, okay. He was in the library and actually just came across all these scratched out books of any explicit material. So he's this is actually a film that's called Rosebud. It's being currently shown at the Venice Biennale.
And he was nice enough to give us
yeah,
this.
So it's kind of great that we can see it today.
Okay.
Okay. So that was kind of a nice one to finish on, because although it functions, can you do that? Quite differently in terms of its use of found footage than the others. It is sort of still using a lot of footage taken from YouTube in the sections which look like a screen. It sort of brings us back round to this idea of the scratch as one that actually betrays its own circulation, whereas with this, obviously, the opposite is precisely the case. It's someone deliberately scratching the image to ensure that it does not circulate. So just to end, I wanted to finish with a quote by Peter Woolen, which Tom Anderson, who's another phenomenal LA-based filmmaker who's actually involved in our project at the colloquium at MPAC, he uses it at the end of his newest movie, Get Out of My Car. It's from Into the Future, Tourism, Language and Art in Raiding the Icebox, which I haven't got the date for, but I think it was about 1991. So, quote, "Modernism is being succeeded not by a totalizing Western postmodernism, but by a hybrid new aesthetic in which the new corporate forms of communication and display will be constantly confronted by new vernacular forms of invention and expression. Creativity always comes from beneath. It always finds an unexpected and indirect path forward, and it always makes use of what it can scavenge by night.